Hey guys, this is Emma, Vivobarefoot's head of sustainability, and I fucking hate the word sustainability. Join me as I talk to a whole bunch of people way smarter than me about how we're all going to make regeneration the new normal. Hey guys, welcome to the Vivobarefoot Regeneration podcast. Our guest today is one of the smartest people I know. He's also one of the most authentic and dedicated people I know. He's worked for many years in the aerospace industry and then at Jaguar Land Rover, leading their sustainability initiatives. He's now the Associate Director at Cambridge University on their Sustainability Leadership Program, which is where we first met, bonding over a mutual love of political satire and complex systems thinking. He believes, and I do agree, that comedy is a big part of the solution to the climate crisis. That if you can just make people laugh, you can have their attention and engage people on the complicated topics that underpin it. So let's start there. It seems like at the moment, every average Joe has become a doctor in medical and political science. Online and offline conversations everywhere are filled with people suddenly believing in and quoting the science around coronavirus. Barely anyone knew who the World Health Organization was before all this. Now it seems like they run the world. What do you think this has happened, and do you think it will change the way people engage with science in the future?
Well, thank you, Emma, for that. I hope I can live up to that introduction that you just given me there. But the World Health Organization clearly in charge because this is their field. This is a global pandemic, and they somewhat sit in the background the rest of the time, producing sort of reports and statistics and giving sage warnings about things. It's interesting that an organization like that should become so front of house. And you see it, even more so with the local health and science ministers being on stage with politicians. That's really quite a moment. I'm struggling to think of moments when you've seen politics and science so cheap by jowl. So it's really quite a moment in our development to see those things so short-circuited. Why has it happened? I think because of the immediacy of this. There's always been this interaction between politics and science, but it's always been rather spread out in time and space, whereas this is happening right now immediately. There are daily statistics, there are daily changes in the status, and it has consequences for us all. It's not a national thing, it's not a particular industry, it's affected just about everybody on the planet. So we've got this immediacy, we've got this intensity, and in our immediate futures, whether we look at it from a personal point of view, from a financial point of view, and in terms of our national futures, all of that's playing out in real time. So these kind of briefings where you see politics and science on stage at the same time, with this backdrop of the World Health Organization behind it, is rather a unique moment and a pause for thought. And we're being forced into that situation right now, without choice. That's just where we're stuck, So we're stuck now for, and not just for a few days of the rolling news cycle, but we're stuck in that mode for weeks, probably months, and with some implications for years. So that's the kind of it's unusual intensity that we get to think about that and experience it.
Why do you think that that's so different to the arguably still very applicable to everyone and very material issues to do with the climate crisis? Because obviously air pollution and water health and, rising seawaters and everything to do with the climate crisis is still very much affecting everyone. Would you not say?
Absolutely. But they play out in very long time frames. They play out over years, if not, decades and possibly lifetimes, depending on which factor you're looking at. So, and we as human beings have evolved in a situation. If you look at our history over a few 100,000 years, most of the time we've had fairly short-term, immediate concerns. Who's that at the door? Is it a tiger? Are the children on fire? Those kinds of things are preoccupied. So our deep sort of visceral instincts are based on, can I survive to the end of the day, and can I look after my immediate family? We've put ourselves through industrialization and modernization into a position where we don't have to worry about those things very much, but our instinct is for those things. And so the two things have become detached. We're saying, well, there's no immediate threat to my family, so I can worry about other things, think more fickle things. And so we've become detached from that. And what this crisis has done is reattached us to that. We're now sitting with our families, worrying about our health and all those immediate things which are there in our gut, in our hundreds of thousands of years of descent. So we've reconnected with what really matters to us, which we've become, in many cases, very far disconnected to, especially in the developed world.
So I guess that's the question then. Do you think that the way that, most people have reacted to this around the world, do you think that will now start to change the way that we approach science?
I think we shouldn't be too optimistic. I think that there's a cup half full, cup half empty piece to this. So the cup half full is that we've realised science matters. We've realised its relevance. We've realised that there's a connection to our future and our well-being and things that we can learn from science that we might need to study more carefully in order to survive, not just prosper in the wider, more traditional sense. I think we should be a little bit skeptical about a revolution. I think once this thing is over, and it will never be completely like it was, but once we're through the crisis element of it, I suspect we will want to rush back to how things more or less were. And I think that, for me, that's a really critical moment, is to hang on to what we've learned from this. We've learned that a lot of the people who we pay least well in society are actually when the stuff hits the fan, they're the most important people we have, and yet we've traditionally treated them rather poorly in terms of working conditions, pay, and so forth. And some of the things we've actually thrown a lot of money and effort at are actually rather fickle and unimportant. So we shouldn't forget that as we get back to whatever normal comes to look like. And some of the things that we've not attended to, and the whole sustainability, climate change, as you say, water, air quality, all those things which we've kind of known about but not treated as urgent, those things are all there as well. This was something we weren't attending to. That people were talking, despite some of the political rhetoric on this, people were talking about this as a risk to humanity that could spread very quickly and have devastating effects. That was known, and it was on a little risk diagram along with many other little risks that we're just bubbling around and jostling for position. The reality is they all matter. And for me, they go on the back burner because it's overwhelming to deal with multiple criteria, because that's just not how we're most comfortable. We're most comfortable focusing on one or two things. The reality of what we do as a profession in sustainability is all of those things matter, which can feel overwhelming, but there are ways of cutting through that. And the whole systems thinking piece, which I talk about a lot, is important. So they're interconnected. How we treat nature and how we treat animals, and whether we see them as a serious part of the equation and worthy of respect, actually affects whether we come into contact with these viruses. So the virus isn't an isolated thing that nobody saw coming and we don't really understand. It's part of a system, and how we treat that system is important. And sustainability is an effort to sort of package those things up and say, well, this is a manageable entity, not a series of trade-offs and separated issues that we can treat in isolation.
Yeah, totally. And I think, call me the ever-ending cynic, but I guess my fear is right now that people are taking the opportunity, and by people I mean institutions, are taking the opportunity with the focus on the coronavirus crisis and maybe I'm just believing too many conspiracy theories, but to not pay attention to all of those kind of interconnected, issues and topics that are all very much related to what we're going through now, how it came about, and what life will look like after. In some ways, I'm worried that the biggest, baddest organizations are kind of getting away with bloody murder at the moment. And I'd be interested to understand if you think that as well, or whether you think that maybe actually it is all being handled okay.
For me personally, it's a bit early to tell. I mean, we're in a moment of crisis, and again, crisis is something I talk a lot about in my sort of daily work. In that crisis is a moment. They're punctuation marks, and how you respond to crisis often dictates a lot about what happens after the crisis. And when you're in the crisis, you're less attendant to those things, which is what gives opportunity. You've described some organisations taking advantage of that opportunity to further their own self-interested agenda. But what I talk about in crisis is it's an opportunity. It's very easy to get distracted by the crisis, which is what gives opportunity for change after it. And the thing is to channel the energy of the crisis. And as I say, the reflections that we all have had, we're all sat here forced to reflect on how we make a living, whether it's important, how we sit in this particular situation, what might happen after that, what we could be contributing to societal outcomes individually, especially if what we're doing as a living at the moment is being deprioritised and we're left with time on our hands. I say how other people make a living and where we allocate resources in society, and we will be forced to think about that. We're going to hit some kind of financial difficulties, if not rather a deep recession. We'll have to choose how we're going to allocate resources after that, and we'll have to make choices about that. But I think we'll go into that with a lot more awareness about what really matters and how we should be rebuilding. And I was very interested to see Amsterdam picking up Kate Raworth's work and saying they're going to think about donut economics as a founding stone of their recovery. That's an isolated case at the moment, but if that became more generalized, that's the kind of opportunity that I see here. And yes, everybody with an angle or an agenda is going to sort of see this as an opportunity to say, yes, now's the time to rebuild, coal mining or whatever. But if you step back and say, well, what have we learned from this? As I say, we've learned that we're very interconnected. We've learned that our way of working is actually quite fragile. Although it seems to have ridden out a lot of storms, it can be broken with this tiny sort of virus thing can completely bring it to a halt in a matter of weeks. So we could make something which is more resilient, more robust, and more thoughtful and more deliberative. So and those models are there, and they're competing, as you say, with people taking more narrow agendas and furthering the continuation of things which we would regard as unsustainable. There is the opportunity to move to something which is more sustainable. And all of those things are competing for attention during the crisis. And I'm keen that we channel those things to make the right informed choices for humanity, not for any narrow sections of humanity, because we are all interconnected. And I say the biggest lesson out of this for me is the interconnectedness of it all. How we treat animals actually affects how we treat us. How we treat healthcare in every part of the world affects the healthcare we all receive. So if somebody's getting bad healthcare, it will come home to roost in your healthcare, even if you can afford very good healthcare. And those kinds of short-circuiting of arguments are really informative to the debate.
I love that. I really love that. And I guess that kind of leads on to the question, like, what is Cambridge University doing to kind of prepare ourselves for that moment? And maybe it's too early in the day to do it, but are you guys already hearing from governments or big business or, local organizations that are keen to build those things in, like Kate Raworth's donut economics? And so I'm interested to understand what you're doing with Cambridge and the university more broadly and the research there.
Yes, well, I can't speak on behalf of Cambridge University as a whole. I'm a senior associate with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, but this is certainly the space we operate in. And yes, there's lots of parallels being drawn between climate emergency and the coronavirus and so forth. I think my take, and I know colleagues agree, we should keep that broad, because again, the danger is we say, well, climate change is the next thing, and again we start doing it incrementally and taking very narrow slices of the agenda. These things are all interrelated. The way the climate works is linked to nature, which is linked to coronavirus and so forth. So making the connections is important. So the Institute is looking at a whole project of building the future we want. That's going to be the path out of this from the Institute's perspective, which is to, as we've always done, is to try and bring together people who are in politics, who are in business and society, and say, okay, how do we actually make sense of this, and how do we actually turn it into digestible policy and industrial practice and so forth? So there's going to be a huge initiative out of this that says, as we recover, how do we do that in a thoughtful, deliberative way, in making it digestible, bringing the best of science into it, making it so that consumers can understand it and incorporate it in their lives, and make it so that industry can make money out of it and survive and prosper out of it, and so that policy can be written around it. So the idea is to use this opportunity as the crisis and the recovery from the crisis to be something that is quite thoughtful and deliberative and discussed between these different entities, rather than it being, as so often happens with crises like this, a bit of a land grab where people just see an opportunity or vacuum and they to improve their own traditional position. Or that we do, as happened perhaps with the financial crisis of 2008, we just try and get the machine back on the rails as much like as it was before, without really thinking about what needs to change.
Yeah, I hear you totally. I mean, we've obviously gone on a huge journey in the last about 10 months at Vivobarefoot to make a big cultural shift around moving from sustainability and just trying to grow a business and do a little less harm to the environment and to people, to fundamentally setting up the entire intent of the business around regenerating and restoring the health of people, the health of communities, and obviously the health of the environment and nature. And arguably in our world, as you know, like the hardest bit is that cultural shift from leadership to the very top to the bottom and everywhere out in between. The reality is now kind of integrating that, implementing that everywhere across the business. And we're really struggling when it comes to understanding how to, put things in place that sit next to how a traditional business is structured in terms of policy and process. So for example, when you're talking about measuring impact as a business, it's really easy to go towards financial metrics where you're talking about the amount of products sold or, profit made or sales generated or customer engagement. But when you come to, how much have you improved biodiversity impact in that area, or how is that person's happiness, health and well-being improved? It all becomes very intangible, and it's really, really difficult. And I guess my hope is that, universities looking into this, and of course the work you're doing is starting to come up with some of those answers, so that the people who really do want to do this, as this momentum picks up, as this kind of shift, this culture shift picks up, and we really start to, fall in love and with the idea of regeneration in the same way we have with sustainability, that there are those solutions there when people want them.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think when I was in the automotive industry, we tried, my team tried as an exercise to sort of map out all of the consequences and causes of what we did across not just climate change in the financial side, but across the whole social, environmental, economic perspective with as a comprehensive set of metrics as we could. And I guess there's a kind of loose rule that says, the more comprehensive it is, the more approximate it has to be. But it gave us an impression of what actually mattered and what was connected to what, and how various interventions could align. And from that, we were able to derive what we felt was a sustainable strategy. And say, if we do these things, a relatively short list, 5 or 6 things that you do that actually addresses the whole gamut of issues, so that then becomes digestible. But we got quite deeply into the metrics and say causes and consequences. And I say we learned a lot about what really mattered and some things that didn't matter that perhaps were still being attended to and so on. So your best approximation is probably a lot better than what you've been working with traditionally. So a lot of these numbers were provisional, and we had to improve some, and we decided to discard others because they probably didn't matter so much when we looked at them closely. So that kind of understanding your impacts and dependencies and enumerating them to some degree, knowing that there's limitations in that process, allows you to really understand what your opportunity is and helps you steer towards a strategy which can tackle probably many of those issues without having to make a 1,000-item to-do list out of it. You can keep it quite manageable. And the link between those things really is systems thinking, to say how does my system interact with other systems, whether it's climate or forestry or marine or whatever. And once you understand that, you say, well, yeah, there is a path through this, which is a manageable set of business strategies that I can sell to my shareholders, to my customers, to my employees, my supply chain, and we can all get behind it. And what we have here is an opportunity to step back from all of that and reevaluate it and get onto a better course. And that's really what can come out of this. The danger is that we say, okay, all these industries have been damaged. They just need to be making money until they all get back to where they were. We question as to the value they're bringing or the value that they're missing.
Yeah, I suppose that's, again, the cynical side of me is a little bit very scared that is exactly what's going to happen. And I mean, a lot of people are celebrating at the moment the fact that they can see the water in Venice and, that they can see the Himalayas in Nepal at the moment. And people are lauding the success of the environmental movement. And I'm kind of just sitting there like, no, the airline's going to come back twice as hard next year to try and make up for the money they've lost this year. There's no way that this is an achievement for sustainability. I just failed to believe it.
Yeah, and again, it's too early to tell. I think the hope we have, the opportunity we have, is to take. I mean, when you look at how much we've collectively learned, and again, this isn't an event in that, like news items often say they do a 24-hour news cycle and that's it. And and one or two events recently have gone on for rather longer, and we get a bit bored of them. But I mean, this is something where we've never had a thing where we've all globally sat at home with the opportunity to think about these things and reflect on them. So that global shared experience is quite an interesting thing, and for it to be done under some duress, again, the sort of surviving a difficult experience is one of the things that binds people together, and yet they're separate. So there's some really interesting conundrums in here which have the opportunity to wake us collectively up to a bit different and better future. But that idea will be competing with much more conservative ideas of getting things back to how they were and as quickly as possible. As you say, perhaps putting environmental laws or other things on one side in order to allow that to happen. But that to me, that's a very outmoded, short-sighted way of seeing things, and also not really learning the lessons of this. How we've treated the environment is part of the cause of where we are. So being even more negligent towards the environment is only going to amplify the problems. It's not going to solve them at their root, and that's what we should be focusing on.
My question is, what is your advice? And if you could take action, if you were someone who believed in what you were saying and wanted to be a part of that, whether you were just someone that has never been exposed to this topic before, someone who is very educated around this, what is your advice and what would you do?
I think my advice would be to learn a little bit more about it. It's always helpful to try and study these things. We've all got some time on our hands at the moment that perhaps wasn't there before. So it's an opportunity to do some learning, to read, to try and understand what's happening and try and understand where you sit in relation to those issues. Again, we see, I mean, you've talked about different industries and things, but, we've seen just in the past few days, the automotive industry, the car racing industry, the aerospace, and making respirators and all these things. They didn't even know they were capable of these things, I suspect, until somebody said, we really need this and people's lives depend upon it. And by the way, there's nothing else for you to do with your people and your equipment. And suddenly, all this innovation is coming out. So that's the potential we're sitting on. No one's ever asked the exam question, how do you do those things? How do you make the biggest possible contribution to society? So we're sitting around all that possibility. I've interacted much more with my neighbours than I have for ages, much more with my family than I have for ages. And these are all things I don't have time for. But I do have time for, and I should make time for those things. So we're all discovering things about ourselves that we didn't know, and we're all discovering potential that was always there, but it was untapped and sort of constrained by the sort of millstone of doing what we've kind of trained ourselves to do over the years. So I think that reflection is a huge opportunity. And in terms of advice, again, I come back to the thing, and Elon Musk has said this, the source of a lot of his genius is to say, what does society need on one hand? What can science offer? And how can I contribute to the direct linkage between those two things? And as we said from the start here, science has suddenly come to the fore as this goldmine of ideas and guidance for policy and all these kinds of things in a way that it's slightly been suppressed. And Greta Thunberg says, that you shouldn't be implementing what is politically expedient. You have to implement what science really requires, because it's not going to negotiate in that sense. It's just going to carry on with what it does. So if you know what science requires and what it's capable of, and you know what society needs, and if you can short circuit those two things, and if you can help with that short circuiting, then the maximization of value to humanity pours out of that. And I say, but look at the possibilities. Look at the possibilities of what can be done. Look at the energy. Captain Tom with his fundraising. People suddenly relate. He's hoping to raise £1,000 and overachieved by many thousands of percent already, and it's going up every day. But that struck a chord with everybody. Everybody saw something in that. That's the bit, the thing that we need to mobilise is people's best selves, not their worst selves. And I think the majority of people are absolutely up for making the best contribution they possibly can to society. They don't want to come up and wreck the planet and wreck other people's lives. They want to do something positive, and to see that opportunity for yourself and say, okay, what can I do today? I can go out and help somebody, possibly save somebody's life. I think most people respond to that. Again, that's the part of how we've evolved as human beings, is protect others, to look after each other. And we put into situations now where those connections have been reshaped and revised and short-circuited, and we find a better self inside ourselves. And I think that's the bit that I'd like to see sort of bottled and generalised.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a balance though, right? Because I think that, if you look at the course that you teach on, for example, the Sustainable Value Chains course, of which I myself was a student a couple of years ago, I think that you'd find that most students that attend that, most students would have gone through some level of experience of environmental hardship or humanitarian hardship, which make them learn a lesson and want to have a thirst to understand why that's happened more, and then, what the potential solutions are, and then work obviously with a community of like-minded people to come overcome that issue. And I think, I really do want to see a movement back towards an appetite for having the challenging conversations, both from a consumer level, but more importantly from an industry level, so that we can get the right policies in place. There's a couple of brands running around at the moment claiming to be carbon neutral or carbon positive in the fashion industry. And anyone who knows this industry knows that carbon data is so bad. It's based off really bad secondary data, and progress is progress, right? And we should celebrate that. But the more you dress up bad data in pretty clothing, it's still a turd underneath, to be frank.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, the whether we can polish turds or roll them in glitter is a long-standing conversation, and I recognise, the program that you and I met through is perhaps a group of self-selecting people in the sense that they put themselves forward for this and have had some kind of experience, or perhaps have grown up with a particular worldview. And it's great to work with people in that space and they're motivated that way. The other half of what I do is to talk to people who weren't necessarily, for business people, finance people, people from sectors who are having a hard time, people at plastic sector who suddenly have had their own crisis prior to the current pandemic, whose futures are on the line, who understand these issues and want to learn more. And when you work with people in large numbers, and I past couple of years have helped me work with several thousand people in that kind of perspective, and they come along and they feel the same way that you and I do, in sort of understanding that there are issues, and they want to learn more. That is really mobilizing, motivating, because those aren't the usual suspects. That isn't who you'd expect to have in the room. That isn't the people who you say, yeah, hang on, we're going to have to look at our business. And when the senior management of those companies actually come along and put money on the table to train their people, maybe many or all of their senior people, to say, this is how we're going to operate in the future, that is a really positive movement. And that was happening before coronavirus. Coronavirus is only sort of fueling that fire to say, these issues matter, there's interconnectivity, there are risks that we don't understand or that we've downplayed or that could surface. And all of this kind of is available to us, is what we teach as an institute, and there are ways of dealing with it. There are ways which are manageable. It's not overwhelming. It can be dealt with, but it requires a level of understanding and a certain perspective which helps you incorporate it. And nobody yet, in the years I've been doing this, has come to us and spent some time with us and gone away saying, well, I thought it was a load of rubbish. I think you've missed the point altogether. You've made no impact on me. I'm going to go back to my desk and do exactly what I was doing before. That's never happened. Maybe people are incredibly polite, but I suspect they've paid enough money, they'd be asking for it back rather than being that polite. I think people go away with a changed perspective, and it's common for people to go away from these programs with a changed life. They actually see life differently, which sounds perhaps overplaying it, but it's a common comment, because I see my life differently, I see my career differently, I see my business differently, and I am going to go out there and do as much change as I can. And that's the stuff I hang on to. Yes, the world's full of politics and PR and worldviews that are not aligned to this. But when you see large numbers of people in influential positions going away saying, yeah, this has to change, and I'm committed to changing my part of the universe, that is inspiring. And that's the thing I grab onto and try and turn into positive energy.
Well, that's probably a good place to wrap up, actually, because I think your inspiration and your motivation and your steadfastness on this is incredible. And I'm really glad that we're able to share it with a few more people. And I'm really, really looking forward to following people like you out of all of this, all of this crisis and all of this darkness into the light. So sounds like are we starting a cult? We
always will.
So just lastly, where can people go to find out a little bit more about you and about the course?
So you can Google CISL, Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and a whole variety of courses there, online, face-to-face, customized, senior, introductory courses and so on. So there's a whole range of offerings there, which you can find online.
Amazing. Thanks so much for taking the time, Ian.
Thanks so much. Great to talk to you.
See you soon. Bye. Well, that's it for today. If you managed to get the entire way through this podcast without getting really annoyed by my bloody Australian accent, you deserve an award. For more information and to listen to the other episodes, go to vivobarefoot.com. See you later.